Yeah, my dad's dead.
How many people are there?
There's like 6, my whole family's dead.
Okay.
It looks like they've been beaten to death. I don't know, man.
Okay.
I don't know what to do, man.
On August 29, 2009, Margaret Orlinsky stood on the porch of her mobile home in Glenn County, Georgia, when she watched her neighbor, 22-year-old Guy Hines Jr., burst from the door of his mobile home, waving his arms frantically, screaming, "My entire family is dead." Margaret Orlinsky promptly called 911 and began exchanging information with the dispatcher before handing the phone off to Hines Jr.
911, where's your emergency?
New Hope Plantation, Highway 17 North.
Okay, by New Hope, what's going on, ma'am?
There's a kid, guy just came home and his whole family is dead. He's kind of hysterical. I can't understand. I haven't gone over there yet.
Okay, tell me what the accident is. What's his name?
He's freaking out. It's Guy.
Guy, what's his last name?
Guy, what's your last name? What's your last name, honey? Huh? Yeah, here, talk to him. I just got home, my whole family's dead.
Okay, tell me what's going on, sir. What?
I just got home I was out last night, I got home just now, and everybody's dead. My dad's dead.
How many people are there?
There's like 6, my whole family's dead.
Okay.
It looks like they've been beaten to death. I don't know, man.
Okay.
I don't know what to do, man.
Okay. Take a deep breath. Vic, I'm coming for you. Just stay on the line with me, okay?
With the police en route, Guy Hines Jr. ran back into the mobile home and began checking the pulses of all of his family members. He came across his essential brother, Michael Toller, a 19-year-old with special needs, still clinging to life on the floor. Guy Hines Jr. was found still sitting with Michael Toller when the police arrived. Michael Toller was rushed to the emergency room, but unfortunately would die days later. Police entered the house and found a grisly scene. 7 family members beaten to death, strewn across the house. They were only able to locate one other survivor, a 3-year-old who we will call BJ as to protect his anonymity. With 7 deceased victims, soon to become 8, this became known as the most deadly mass killing in the state of Georgia. Among the deceased was 44-year-old Russell Toller Sr. and his 20-year-old son, Russell Toller Jr., as well as his 20-year-old daughter, Chrissy Toller, and his 15-year-old daughter, Michelle Toller. Other victims included Guy Hines' father, Guy Hines Sr., Brenda Flanagan, who were 45 and 49 respectively, and 30-year-old Joseph West. Autopsies would reveal that Guy Hines Sr. suffered 22 external wounds, including tears, scrapes, and bruises to his head, neck, and shoulders. Russell Toller, known as Rusty, suffered more than 30 wounds, including a 6-inch laceration at the top of his head. Russell Toller Jr., his son, had several of his teeth knocked out. In addition, he had been bludgeoned and stabbed 3 times. 15-year-old Michelle Toller had over 48 injuries to her head and neck area, as well as broken bones in her hand. All of the victims suffered similar injuries to the head and neck area that most medical examiners would agree all came from the same weapon. BJ, the sole survivor, ended up with brain damage and was not able to help in the prosecution of the case.
It is a horrifying crime that has a small South Georgia community on edge. Who's responsible for the deaths of 8 people in a Glenn County home?
While the medical teams began working on the 2 surviving victims, police started their investigation. One officer talked to both the neighbor and another bystander. Both witnesses said they did not see Guy Hines Jr. bring anything out of his home or put anything in his car that was parked in front of the home that morning. All they had seen was him pulling up, entering the home, and then immediately exiting the home before the 911 call. The police began speaking with Hines to get his story. They immediately noticed he was wearing a polo shirt and khaki shorts that were worn over a pair of silver and black gym shorts, as well as a pair of sandals. Notably, no blood was seen on Guy Hines Jr.'s hands. There were scratches and small cuts, but this was consistent with his job as construction work. Officers did notice several blood smears on the bottom of his outer khaki shorts and on the silver and black gym shorts, as well as the top of his sandals. Blood found on the gym shorts would later be tested, and it would be discovered that the blood belonged to Michael Toller, Russell Toller Sr., and Chrissy Toller. The blood on the top of the sandals belonged to West and Guy Sr. Guy Hines Jr.'s first and main story was that the night before the attack, he bought cocaine from West and that they smoked weed and cocaine together in the home. However, toxicology showed that West did not have any cocaine or marijuana in his system when he died. Alternatively, Guy Hines Jr.'s toxicology showed that he had cocaine, marijuana, and propoxyphene in his system, a sedative. The police asked Hines Jr. if there were any weapons in the house. He admitted that yes, there were 2 shotguns, a 20 gauge and a 16 gauge. Hines Jr. also admitted that he had hidden the 16 gauge shotgun because he believed it was stolen. It would later be revealed that the shotgun itself was not stolen, even though he had believed it was. Police began searching the crime scene and the vehicle. It's important to note that they searched the vehicle under a consent search from Guy Hines Jr. This means that Guy Hines Jr. consented to the search of the vehicle, allowing officers to freely search it without a warrant. In the vehicle, they found the 16-gauge shotgun in the trunk, as well as a bag of marijuana and a bottle containing propoxyphene pills that was prescribed to Michael Toller. Police also found Michelle Toller's phone in the car covered in West's blood. Inside the home, in the same bedroom where the body of Russell Toller Sr. was found, police found a document with smears of blood from Sr. and fingerprints belonging to Guy Hines Jr. Finally, they found a knife in the living room. The knife would later be tested and it would be found to have blood from Russell Toller Jr. on the tip. Initially, the police did not release the cause of death, as they didn't want to bias any potential investigation or future witnesses. However, they were clear about one thing. Guy Hines Jr. was not a suspect yet, at least at this point in the investigation. The day following the killings, Police Chief Matt Doering said, quote, "I wouldn't call Mr. Hines a suspect, but I won't rule him out either." 5 days later, on September 4th, 2009, Guy Hines Jr. was arrested. 10 days later, Hines was indicted by a grand jury, and the prosecutors made it known they intended to seek the death penalty. As in many death penalty cases, the case took many years to get off the ground. Guy Hines Jr. pleaded not guilty his arraignment, which is a court process where the defendant makes his initial plea, on February 23rd, 2012. The trial would still not begin for another year, and on October 25th, 2013, Guy Hines Jr. was convicted of all 8 murders and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. This has been a very bird's eye view of the case. This is about all you'll find when you look around on Google, as there's very little footage, news coverage, or body camera of the incident. Almost everything you can find online is through blogs, subreddit posts, criminal rights groups, and the Hines family themselves. If all you wanted was the cliff notes of this case, I've provided you with a perfect jumping off point. Now we're going to dive into the controversy surrounding the case. First, I think it's important that I talk about my qualifications. I started out my career as a criminal defense attorney for several years. After witnessing several failings in the justice system, both on the side of other defense attorneys and prosecutors, I decided to make the switch and become a prosecutor myself. Through my work in criminal defense and prosecution, I've worked on hundreds of cases, everything from the lowest traffic offenses to the most serious felonies. I would also like to be transparent that I've always been a fan of true crime, and I really find cases like this and controversy in true crime in general to be fascinating. I would never advise you to only listen to one source and to look at all the evidence yourself and weigh the merits of the case on your own scales of justice. What we're going to do now is talk about the state's case, the defense's case, and talk about some of the controversy involved after the fact. Things started getting weird in jury selection. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you're armed with a little bit of perspective about jury selection and what it is. There are attorneys that are paid a lot of money to understand juries and how to pick them. So I'm not going to give you an exhaustive breakdown, but I want you to know at least a little bit while we move forward. So obviously jury selection is the process through which both sides pick the impartial members of the jury. Both sides are given a certain number of strikes depending on the type of charge in the state. These strikes can be used for any reason at all. Maybe the defense attorney thinks that one of the members of the jury pool was lying about one of their answers. Or maybe the prosecutor just picks up a bad vibe from one of the people in the second row. Maybe they didn't even answer some of their questions, but they just had certain facial expressions that the prosecutor didn't like. These are where they use those type of strikes. However, the thing that both sides are focusing on are strikes for cause. These are strikes that are issued by the court when a member of the jury pool proves that they cannot follow the law or will not follow the law in a criminal case. This is where you hear that old joke about pretending to be racist to get out of jury duty. There is some truth to that, but don't try it. A better example in the modern political climate would be a member of a jury pool saying that they don't trust police, they've never trusted police, and if a police officer got up on the stand, they would not believe anything that they said. One of the sides may try to do something called rehabilitate the juror by asking them questions to get them to say, yes, in this case, I could set my bias aside and move forward. However, generally that can be a really big hump to get over if you're trying to rehabilitate a juror who straight up said they could not follow the law. And this can happen for both sides, so it's not a state-centric issue or defense-centric issue. That's about all you'll need to know about jury selection for what's coming next. So let's talk about juror number 152. Yes, the first main thing we have to talk about occurred in jury selection. First off, juror number 152 was a law enforcement officer. Now, some of you may be thinking the defense definitely doesn't want them on the jury, and I'm here to tell you that that's not always the case. So take, for example, if you were a prosecutor and you were prosecuting a DWI. The defendant was clearly drunk, he's falling all over the place, but let's say the police officer didn't do a perfect job administering the field sobriety tests. That's something another law enforcement officer officer is going to notice, and he's going to point out for the rest of the jury. He may even go so far to say that the charges should be thrown out because the tests were done wrong, despite seeing that the defendant was clearly intoxicated. Police officers are going to compare their work to the work being done on the case. So if you don't have a perfect investigation or a near perfect investigation, it's not always great for the prosecution to get a police officer on the jury. But of course, let's flip that. If you know a police officer in your life, ask them how many people they arrest that they believe are guilty. The majority of police officers will tell you that nearly every person they have arrested, they were almost positive that they were guilty. So obviously, it can be concerning for the defense to see a police officer in the jury pool. This is because there's a good chance that police officer is going to look at the defendant and see the eyes of every other person they've arrested throughout their entire career. I'm not going to pretend like having a police officer on the jury isn't better for the state. However, I do want to make it clear that it's not always an obvious choice for the state. However, his status as a law enforcement officer was not the only consequential part of Juror 152. So during jury selection, neither side is allowed to talk about the facts of the case. Generally, they'll talk about their duty, they'll mention the players involved on both sides of the case just to find out if anyone in the jury pool knows of anyone in the case, and they'll let them know what the charges are. Outside of that, it's a lot of testing the jury, seeing how they react to certain things, deciding which members of the jury pool have a thought process that most aligns with the defense or the state. Juror number 152 let them know that his daughter attended the same school as the defendant and was friends with him. He said that his daughter was sad about the killings and didn't understand how it could have happened, and that she had never known Guy Hines Jr. to be a violent person. Now, what's important to note here is that neither side moved to strike juror number 152, and that's either for a cause strike or a preemptory strike. Remember, preemptory ones are the ones they can use for any reason, and juror number 152 was actually seated as a member of the jury. However, throughout the trial and the deliberation, the state then moved 3 times to have juror 152 excused, and every time it was denied. Hours into deliberation, that's when the jury's in the back chamber deciding guilty or not guilty, the foreman came out and let the judge know that they had reached a unanimous verdict on some counts, but they were divided 9-3 on the other counts. It was also revealed that there was a heated conflict in the jury room involving the foreman and juror number 152. Both the state and defense started brainstorming ways to get around this issue. The next morning after the argument, the state agreed to withdraw its notice of intent to seek the death penalty. In return, the defense would agree that juror 152 would be excused from the jury and replaced by one of the alternates. Alternates are kept on standby in case a jury member gets sick or something happens and they can't move forward. Alternates would have been present for the entire trial and would have seen all the information. Now, it's important to note that the parties agreed that the jury would not be informed that the death penalty was no longer available as a sentence. This is important. They didn't want the jury to just find Guy Hines Jr. guilty because now they wouldn't have the conscience of a potential dead body on their hands. Nonetheless, the alternate took over. Later that afternoon, Guy Hines Jr. was found guilty on all counts. Now, this jury selection snafu served as the basis of one of the appeals. So let's have a real quick discussion about appeals. I think there's this idea among the general public that an appeal happens when you don't agree with the outcome of the case. You hear it a lot. They say, oh, they're found guilty. Well, you know they're going to appeal. So you can't just appeal because you don't like the outcome of a case. You have to appeal that there was a specific error made by the judge in the case. Now, how do you show error? Objections. You've definitely heard about objections before. You've probably heard objection, relevance, or objection, hearsay, or objection, assuming facts not in evidence. Once one side objects, the court then makes a ruling. You'll either hear the judge agree with the objection and say sustained, or the judge may disagree with the objection and say overruled. You may have seen parts of a trial before where one of the sides will be insistent to ask for a ruling, even though they knew they lost the objection. This is generally because they think the judge is making a mistake and they want to preserve error for an appeal. Because then, once they've preserved the error and a finding of guilty or not guilty was made, either side can then go up to the appellate court and say, we made this objection, the judge ruled incorrectly, and thus it affected the outcome of the case. Now, obviously not every objection is going to have a huge outcome on the case. It's also why a lot of the times you'll see one of the sides making a motion for summary judgment, or a motion for a judgment notwithstanding the jury. Basically, they're saying that the facts in this case are so one-sided that no reasonable jury could ever come to the conclusion that the person was guilty or not guilty. Now, these are almost always denied by the judge, especially at the end of a trial, because they're going to let the jury decide. However, when it's overruled, if that side did a bad job of preserving error, they would have a basis for an appeal to at least potentially get a look from the appellate court. And that's what happened in this case. And so one of the bases for appeal in this case was the issue of juror number 152. The main contention of one of the appeals was that the defendant's rights were violated by juror number 152 being excused. The ultimate holding by the Supreme Court in Georgia on that issue was that these discussions between the state and the defense occurred throughout the entire morning, and that the defense had ample time to talk to the defendant and get his input on the decision. So that basis for appeal was denied. But it wasn't wasn't the only appeal. However, reading appeals can be really vital when reviewing a case, especially if you're making a YouTube video about it, because generally the appellate court will write a finding of facts. This is where they write down basically all of the facts that were found by the jury and how they came to their decision. And they'll usually do a review to show that a jury was either well-founded or not well-founded to come to the decision that they made. This is often looked at in the light most favorable to the verdict, and the judges in this appeal believe that with the amount of evidence that was shown at trial, the jury could have reasonably found the defendant guilty. Based on the information that can be found online, the state's main theory of the case was that the evidence showed Hines entered the bedroom where Russell Toller Sr., Rusty, and started fighting with him over pills that belonged to his son, Michael. The state believed that Hines killed Toller Sr. and then beat Michael Toller to death after he woke up in the middle of the fight. It's the state's theory that then he went from room to room in the mobile home, killing each occupant by beating them to death with the 16-gauge shotgun. As far as motive, the state points to the drugs and money. Guy Hines Jr. was found with several $100s in cash on him, as well as pills belonging to Michael Toller. I doubt that'll be sufficient for a lot of people, but what you have to think about in these situations is that the jury is basically told to weigh the credibility of the testimony given by the witnesses and by the experts. So on appeal, appellate judges are going to give a lot of credence to the jury in making their findings a fact. I want to highlight a lot of the objections that you see online for this case, but I want to lead with one that gets thrown around a lot. Glenn County DA Jackie Johnson was dismissed due to her potential role in the Ahmaud Arbery incident in Glenn County. She's currently under investigation for how that case was handled, and we'll see if and how she's punished in the near future. However, I think to equate the two would be rough, just because the two cases are so unlike each other. However, there is a prevailing idea among internet speculators that if she was corrupt in one area, then she likely would be corrupt in other areas and maybe cut corners to get cases closed. Upon my preliminary look, I didn't see anything where the DA's office would have been cutting corners, but anything's possible. Outside of that, we get to pretty typical arguments you see in these cases. Guy's Voice is a small group trying to fight for Guy Hines Jr.'s innocence. In a lot of forum posts online, you'll see that it's mainly the same few people who are repeating a lot of these talking points, which doesn't mean it should be dismissed summarily. You're going to see a lot of times in cases like this that, and even ones that get overturned, it starts with a small contingent of people. So just because it's the same few people fighting for the innocence here really shouldn't detract too much. However, it should be important to note what kind of experience they have in the field, as well as what arguments they're making. The main arguments they're making are really similar to what you see in almost every similar case where they're arguing for an appeal. Chief among them is that the case was really built on circumstantial evidence. For the most part, that seems to be true. There's no eyewitness to the murder. There's no video footage. It's coming down to the fact that Guy Hines Jr. knew the victims, lived with them, he was on drugs, he lived there, and the blood found on him as well, though that could partially be explained by him going from person to person and checking their pulses. However, I don't necessarily think that's a full wrap-up of the evidence, especially when we look at fingerprints on the documents that were in Russell Toller Sr.'s room, as well as the items that were stolen from the house, and subsequently found on Guy Hines Jr. Another one of the common debates here is a flawed investigation, basically saying that the police zeroed in on Guy Hines Jr. and didn't really look at any other suspects and failed to follow up on some leads. You see this one get thrown around a lot, and it's difficult because a lot of times you'll hear of leads that weren't followed up on. There are a lot of people who fail to understand just how many tips will come in on a case. A case like this could generate hundreds, if not thousands, of potential tips. The vast majority of those are going to lead nowhere. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that police officers should just ignore them. They should be going through finding the credible ones and pursuing it. But it does mean that just because some tips were not followed up on doesn't necessarily mean that it was a bad investigation. One of the bigger issues that gets brought up by detractors online is usually how the evidence was handled, mostly discussing the blood that was at the scene. Some people believe that the blood wasn't adequately tested or not enough blood was tested. Also, one of the officers on the case kept Guy Hines Jr.'s clothing overnight and didn't immediately bring it into evidence, which did break the chain of custody. Chain of custody is something in evidence that you'll see where you want to have a perfect log of where evidence was from person to person all the way along the line, and that's also how you prove it up at trial. To use a DWI, sometimes officers will take from a DWI suspect, put it in a case, put it in their trunk, and there it will sit for a month. And there's a lot of debates on whether or not that ruins the integrity of the testing. That's what they talk about as far as breaking the chain of custody. They want to be able to track that evidence from point A to B to C to D and so on. That being said, just like the case against Guy Hines Jr. was very circumstantial, it does seem like a lot of the debate around the verdict in this case is pretty circumstantial in itself. A lot of it comes down to things weren't done 100% correct. I would argue you do want things to be done as close to 100% as possible, especially in a case where someone's life is on the line. However, like you'll hear a lot of attorneys say, the case is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt. And in this case, he was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a full jury of his peers. Most recently, he lost his 2020 appeal, and it looks like there's no real future for a Guy Hines Jr. Innocence Project. However, I will admit that the resources for this case online were extremely thin. I had to go through many different sources and blogs and old articles with missing videos to put together what I've put together here. So in the interest of giving you the best possible experience and closure on this case, I'm actually opening up a public records request for all the documents involved in the trial. It may end up being nothing, but I do want to read through it and give you some closure and see if everyone can feel better about this verdict based on a second look over 10 years later. Because while I've talked about a lot of the main criticisms in this case and the doubts in this case, there's one that everyone, myself included, there's one question that keeps popping up in everyone's minds and in everyone's posts online, and that's the really simple question: how did one person in their early 20s beat 8 people to death in a mobile home without much bigger signs of struggle and injuries on himself, without any assistance? That's a question I hope to answer as we dive through the documents. I have seen some people say that it's possible that he had help committing the crimes. At this point, I would find that very unlikely. It would be strange for him to be sitting in jail for over a decade just out of loyalty to another attacker or other attackers that might have helped them. While there are a lot of things in this case that I think Guy's voice is blowing out of proportion, that is one question that has really plagued me throughout the research for this video. So if you're looking for an update, please let me know. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this story so far. This is my first video I've ever made that was longer than a minute, so thank you so much if you're still hanging on here with me. As I said earlier, I switched from the criminal defense side to the prosecution to try to right some of the wrongs I saw on both sides of the bar in upholding defendants' rights. However, that does mean I switched from making criminal defense money to making prosecutor money, so any support you guys could give would be amazing. We just launched our Patreon. I'm going to be uploading some extra behind the scenes, some extra research, and as I get documents for this case and others, I'll be sharing what I can from them and maybe giving some sneak peeks, doing some polls on what you guys want to hear about next. So thank you so much for jumping on this train. We're going to crack this one and many others. I've been Good Bayou Boudreaux. Have a good night.